Sure. So at the end of World War II, when globalization started, the countries that we now know as the advanced world started advancing to become what we now know. They started to industrialize in a very big way in the 50s and the early 60s in particular. And in that process, people started to move off of the farm into higher value added jobs. Industrialized inputs such as fertilizers and fuels were making it to the countryside. That meant you could grow more food with fewer people. Those people were freed up to move into the town where the new manufacturing jobs were. And that generated the pattern that held true until very recently. Because first we did it with the advanced world, then the advanced developing world, and then poorer parts of the developing world in three distinct phases. When you move to the town, you have fewer kids. But it doesn't show up as smaller populations right away. It takes about 50 years. As you industrialize your healthcare system and things like antibiotics and sutures become more common, the mortality rate drops. So a great example is China. They started industrializing in about 1980, but from 1980 to 2020, roughly 3/4 of their population expansion wasn't from new births. It was simply from people living longer. So for the first 50 years, give or take, of your expansion in that way, your population gets bigger, but the number of children you have stays the same or actually shrinks. And after 50 years, you have now aged long enough that you no longer have people to have children. And that is the situation we find increasingly true in any number of countries. Germany and Italy and Belgium and Korea are there now. So is China. The next round will have the Netherlands. It'll have Thailand. It'll have Brazil. And so we already know what the demographics of the future are going to be, assuming that there's no big breakdown in trade relations or economic norms, simply because we've been on this path for a while already. Oh, absolutely. Those are all supporting factors. The industrialization, urbanization experience is far and away number one. So clearly, but that doesn't mean that countries aren't capable of making their situation worse. So the Chinese population bomb was going to happen regardless. But doing the one-child policy and mass selective sex abortions for females throughout the entire period that the urbanization was going on made it terminal in the 2000s rather than the 2020s, as it probably would have been otherwise. So we're looking at the collapse of the Chinese demographic picture this decade, not next decade or the 2040s, this decade, because of those compounding factors. Population is a big part of that, because if you run out of people in their 20s and 30s, you've lost your consumption base, and your only way to keep the system running is to export. So this is the Japanese, the Korean, and the German model. But if you break down global trade, whether it's because the Americans go their own way or populism bursts up in a lot of places, or you have a heavily mercantilist country like China or a war like what's going on in Russia, all of that breaks supply chains and makes it difficult, if not impossible, for countries to get the raw materials they need to keep an industrialized system going. One of the great achievements of globalization is about bringing the inputs, food, energy, raw materials, to every country of the world who wants to play, which is every country of the world, pretty much. But if you break down the supply systems, the technologies of industrialization are not sustainable without those inputs. So we're going to see large portions of this world, China is the country I'm most concerned about, deindustrializing as they simply can no longer maintain the inputs that make modern life possible. And keep in mind that two of the aspects of modern life are electricity and food. Well, you can have terminal deindustrialization and you can have terminal depopulation. 50 years on, 75 years on from globalization, number of countries whose demographic profile has gone terminal. Whenever you look at a profile, what it should be, what is normal, is a lot of children, fewer teenagers, fewer 20-somethings, 30-somethings, and so on, and makes a pyramid. But there are a huge number of countries where it's more like this, with a small base of children then going up, and there's actually more elderly than there are workers. We're on the verge of that in many places. Those are countries who have aged past the point of any hope of a demographic resurgence. So this is Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, Germany, Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, Italy, Belgium, and just to give you a quick sampling. These are all
Mhm.
countries that we know are going to vanish over the course of the next century because they just won't have people unless they greatly redefine what their nationality means, like, say, Australia or Canada have. There's really no way out. Uh, Countries that are terminal in terms of industrialization. These are countries where the resources don't just come from not within their own borders, but from a different continent. And they lack the military capacity to secure those things for themselves, or even to secure the sea lanes that are necessary for civilian shipping to come and go. China is far and away at the top of the list. Germany is far and away number two. This is not a new problem for the Germans. We've seen this multiple times throughout their history, that they have the industry and they've got the population, they've got the skills, but they don't have the inputs in the markets. And under NATO and the EU, the Germans haven't had to go all Highlander on everybody in order to get that. But you break down American support or European collegiality, and that kind of goes away. So we're going to have an interesting conversation here this summer when the Russians are offering the Germans energy they need to keep going for a price when it comes to cooperation or lack thereof in the Ukraine war. And we're going to see a lot of things challenged because right now Europe is more united than it has been since the Treaty of Westphalia. I mean, this is really weird. We've never seen this level of agreement without first having the bottom fall out. But Ukraine and the Americans being involved in the Ukraine war has generated a lot of solidarity. But as the Russian energy stops flowing for a mix of reasons, the Russians will have the option for keeping Germany supplied. Their pipeline goes a different route, it goes under the water directly to Germany. And so Germany will have a choice between having energy and electricity and industry and partnering with Russia, or not, and deindustrializing. So we're going to have a lot of countries in that general situation with some hard choices to make this year. It depends on where you are and depends on which gadget you're talking about. So I expect a North American manufacturing system to do very well in this world that we're going into. Most of our resources are within the hemisphere. The United States has the healthiest demography for both production and consumption in the world, and Mexico has the most favorable demographic structure for production and consumption in the advanced developing world. And courtesy of NAFTA and NAFTA 2, we're partners. This is great. However, there are two economic sectors that are exceptions. The first is agriculture, because American producers are so efficient, they have to export about 1/3 of what they produce. That is going to generate some interesting mismatches as the breakdown happens. And then the second is specifically tech manufacturing. For the most part, the United States producers, in league with foreign investors, own everything: aerospace, automotive, timber products. It's all done here. But tech manufacturing specifically is a problem, because to do tech manufacturing and electronic manufacturing, you have to have different price points for labor to represent the different parts that go into a product. So if you're going to have a modern desktop phone, there's a wiring system, there's a plastic shell, there may be a battery unit. All of those are going to be done by different workforces, with different rates of compensation and different rates of skill. And one of the reasons electronics have been done so well in East Asia is you have the high end in Japan and Korea and Taiwan. You have the mid-range in Malaysia and Indonesia. You've got the low end in China, and then the bargain basement in places like the Philippines. And different countries are playing in here. The Indians are trying to jump over and go straight to the high end. The Vietnamese are trying to jump over to China and become the next Thailand. There's a lot going on, but there's all kinds of different price points. And from the low end to the high end, it's a difference of a factor of about 10 for wages. That is really good for electronics and cell phones.